First, you're going to hear from Andy Huse. Andy Huse is a librarian who specializes in archives at the University of South Florida's Tampa campus special collections. It's a great collection there. I bother Andy all the time, and he helps me out. You're also going to hear today from Jeff Houck. He is the Marketing and Public Relations Manager for the Columbia Restaurant Group in Tampa, and he spent 25 years in newspaper and multimedia journalism, and most recently as a features editor, food writer, and podcaster at the Tampa Tribune. So he will be our panelist as well. And then last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Bárbara C. Cruz. She is a professor of social science education at the University of South Florida. She has been a faculty member at USF since '91, and she has taught undergraduate and graduate courses and conducted research on global and multicultural issues, and has provided professional services to a number of educational organizations and initiatives, and it is a pleasure for us to have her here today. So without further ado, I'll stop talking. I'm going to hand it over to our panelists, and thank you for coming today.
Thank you, Brad. Welcome. Thank you for coming tonight. I had to brave those chilly weather to get here, so there is Spanish bean soup out there if you need to keep the frostbite at bay. We're just going to go through a small presentation, but I have to tell you, I've written a lot of journalism, I've done a lot of online things. I've never been part of a book project, and I got to tell you, it is a much different experience, and especially when it's a subject that invokes this much passion. I don't have to, the giggles tell me you know what I'm talking about. And we'll get into all that later. But I was telling someone earlier, I thought this would be a very small, local, fun, kitschy project. And it has ignited wildfires and spurned volcanoes. And apparently it brought a hurricane here, I don't know. But it has been an incredibly rewarding experience to see the reception that this book has had. I was lucky enough to be invited by Andy to be part of the project, to write profiles for the book around his history of it. But we like to kind of walk you through it a little bit. Let's see here, let's get started. I am an amateur when it comes to PowerPoint, so I'll do the best I can. So, the big question, and this is an existential question and a realistic question. What makes a Cuban sandwich? So one of the profiles that's in the book is obviously what I consider to be the finest bread making facility in the world when it comes to Cuban bread and many other items. The fourth generation family owned La Segunda. La Segunda Central Bakery, I should finish the whole sentence, I'm sorry. And Andy wrote the profile of the Morey family, and I'd maybe want to say a few words about La Segunda and what its role is in the sandwich.
Well, I mean, if we have a Cuban sandwich trail,
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. If we have a Cuban Sandwich Heritage Trail, it has to start with La Segunda and the Columbia. They both probably were serving sandwiches, or Columbia was starting to serve sandwiches probably around the time that the La Segunda was in business. So yeah, those are basic building blocks of kind of learning about the Cuban. Unfortunately, there aren't any landmarks that we can point to in Havana, but that's another story. We'll talk about that later.
So I think a lot of people like to focus on the ingredients of the sandwich to get to the answer of the question, what makes a Cuban sandwich? And a lot of people get, kind of out of joint about salami, yes or no, right? Genoa salami. I love the giggles, I got to tell you. You know what you're talking about. But I argue the bread is the framework for the start of the conversation. And anybody who's had Miami versions of Cuban bread versus Tampa Cuban knows that there's a vast difference. And the fact that, it was made here so early and is so integral in terms of the story of Tampa, that, the Ferlita family at one point was making like 25,000 to 30,000 loaves a week at their bakery. Italians making Cuban bread. That's a Tampa story, a lot of cross-pollination going on. One of my favorite things about the bread story is the story of a man named Vicente Martí, who was a stonemason by trade. And because, you don't always have the money to hire the right people, the bakers would try and clean their ovens with water before it was, temperature was low enough, so it would crack. And Vicente would fix the ovens by wrapping himself in burlap and being shoved in like a piece of bread into the oven, do his work for as long as he could stand it, being brought out, wet down again, go back in until he was done. He did this for 20 years, 25 years. That's a Tampa story. Miami doesn't have that. So nothing against Miami, but bread is a very integral part of the Cuban sandwich story. It's the first crisp and crunch and flavor that you get when you bite into the sandwich, and how you treat it and what you do to it matters greatly. Andy, you want to talk about the palm leaf?
Yeah, of course, the palmetto leaf is something that's very well known, at least if you're a Tampa Cuban sandwich fan, Cuban bread fan. And what's interesting is this goes back to Cuba, but it's no longer practiced there. So it was pretty pervasive around the turn of the century, people using this. And basically, if you're making a baguette, you would use a razor or something and cut slits in the top so that it could gas out. This basically achieves the same thing, but in a very rustic way. And so a lot of people, like Americans, when they first went to Cuba, they were like, why is there banana leaves all over the bread? But of course, it's not banana leaves, it's a palmetto leaf. And there's actually a whole book, and I was proudly the first one to cite it, by John O. Miller, and it's a whole history of the palmetto, and it's worth checking out.
Do you want to talk a bit why they use the palm leaf? Does it serve any kind of function when it comes to the baking of the bread?
Right. So yeah, I mean, it first of all, it serves to kind of break the top open so that you can get, it's gassing out, so you don't have it too unruly, like bulges and bubbles and stuff. But then also, it would serve as sort of a litmus test, a thermometer kind of. So if you see that palmetto leaf singeing, you know that you've got a hot spot in the oven, or it's running too hot, you got too much wood. You need to shift things around. So before the whole loaf is in jeopardy, you start to see kind of the telltale signs. So that leaf's sort of the canary in the coal mine to tell you, move things around before you burn your bread.
So as Vice President of Marketing for the Columbia Restaurant Group, I can tell you that the number one expense at the Columbia is not people, facilities, insurance, it's bread. Because everybody who eats at the Columbia is offered a slice of La Segunda Central bread. We use it for sandwiches, bread pudding, any number of things. The number 5 expense is the whipped butter that comes with it. And the number 1 complaint I get, because I read all the reviews, is that there's a hair in my bread. And it's not. It's a piece of the palm leaf. So it's always fun to answer those questions by saying, no, really, it's not a hair. I don't recommend it as a profession, but it's just part of my job. And there you go. And a story recently came out that said that there was a threat to the tradition of the palm because of somebody retiring. What was that story in the microphone?
I think it had more to do with the labor behind it. I was like, there's no shortage of palmettos. The state's covered with them. So, but no, I think it had something to do with. I think it was just a good opportunity to get in the news. Honestly.
Got it. Yeah. Hey, look at the hair. Okay.
Yeah, once again, though, you can see it's kind of unruly compared to like a baguette, that's really smooth and sort of uniformly plump. This is sort of all over the place, and I think it'd probably be much more even if you did use a razor or something, but I think that's really distinctive to Cuban bread. It shouldn't be perfect.
If you ever get a chance to get a tour through the back of the baker, they'll give them to you all day long. They do 3 shifts a day making Cuban bread in addition to other pastries that they do. And now they have other locations now that the 4th generation's growing the business. Also in St. Pete, and then they had just bought the Fido Bakery up in Seminole Heights for more capacity because the demand is that big. To see them go through and lay all the palm leaves down and work the process, it's like watching a ballet. It's an amazing thing to see. I highly recommend it anytime you get a chance. So we start with the basic here. We have our Spanish ham. It's the first layer of the Cuban sandwich at the Columbia restaurant, and we're very precise about how we build the architecture of the sandwich, but I'll talk about that at another point. But you want to discuss the ham and its role as an ingredient?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge favorite of Cubans. It was I mean, it was probably the most popular sandwich in America at the time, the ham sandwich as well. So it's just a great foundation. And you know, Spain and China have a really good debate about who makes the best, like, ancient way of making ham. You know, it's like Serrano ham against, well, an even older Chinese recipe. Anyway, so this wouldn't be, you know, this would be some pretty serious ham. Like, we think of like boiled ham today, but this would be like nice imported from Spain.
And can you talk a little bit about the bolo hams that are a part of that tradition, especially out of Miami?
Right. So yeah, bolo hams it's a deboned ham, and you know, some people say that's, you know, the first, you know, erosion of flavor. Right, you're taking the bone out of the meat, but the boneless hams, and they're kind of pressed to the shape of a ball, so that's how you get the bolo name. So then they're very easily sliced. They tend to be, you know, on the sweet side because you know, ham that goes into Cuban sandwiches tends to be sweet. Back in the old days, they'd glaze it here, often, you know, and some people still do.
Yeah, it's one of the practices. About 15 years ago, Richard Gonsbart, the fourth generation caretaker at the Columbia, realized after some feedback that the sandwich wasn't up to par of what it used to be. And he went back and researched it, and literally over generations, little shortcuts have been taken for either economy or labor or convenience. And so he went back to the original recipe. The earliest printed version they had was from 1915. And they looked at this recipe and realized the gap in what was being done. So he went back to the scoring and the glazing and the roasting of their own ham, the mojo preparation of marinating the pork and roasting it in-house and going back to that. But it's hard. It's a labor-intensive sandwich, and it looks like one item, but there's any number of recipes within there that makes it even more complex. And I guarantee you, a majority of the people in this room, if you've made it a Cuban sandwich from scratch at home, no hands? Well, a couple, okay. We're putting you on a watch list because you care a lot about it. But it's a hard sandwich to make well, much less make it at home. I know, Andy, you did that one time in a backyard operation and in front of house operation, and it's labor intensive. I tried to make Cuban bread one time, and it tastes like Cuban bread, but it looked like some sort of hate crime. It just was not. I even tried with the palm leaf, and it didn't work. But it's a deceptively complex sandwich. So there's the basic ingredients that we have at the Columbia, where we have Genoa salami with the black peppercorn. We import it from Italy because no domestic salami maker puts black peppercorn in it. That just gives it that little bit on the back of your palate. We have the scored and glazed ham, the Swiss cheese, and then the roast pork, the mustard, and the pickles, obviously. You know, in doing research, Barb, I know you found a gentleman, if you want to talk about the Swiss cheese, you know, most everybody you talked about Swiss cheese is like, oh yeah, we picked this or picked that, but you found someone who was very passionate about it.
Yeah, if you go ahead and you advance
Your
the
mic, I'm sorry.
If you go ahead and advance the slide, you will see that the gentleman, for him, there is only one possible Swiss cheese, and that was Finlandia. And when I interviewed him, he's from El Artesano restaurant up in New Jersey. I said, well, what kind of Swiss cheese do you use? There was, you know, silence on the phone. Finlandia or nada, right? Or nothing. I mean, nothing else is going to be able to stand up. And so that's why we wanted to share that with you.
And it's the kind of cheese that's shelf stable. You know, you're not dealing with a Gouda or a Brie or anything like that that's super too much melty, creamy, salty. It works well as a binder, but also as a texture and a flavor component. But you know, what you use matters, and to that gentleman it certainly did. Pickles, you know, I know when Richard was remaking the sandwich, they tested all kinds of pickles. Dill pickle chips wound up working. He only uses 2 per sandwich, 1 per hemisphere of the sandwich. If it's too pickly, it's too much flavor. You don't want it to be a pickle sandwich, and that carries a lot of flavor as it is. What do you think the pickles, what role do you think they play?
I mean, they definitely cut through the savoriness and the fattiness of the pork. And I remember when we were doing an interview with one of the purveyors of the sandwich in Miami from Sergio's restaurant. and these folks win all kinds of awards, you know, every year. He said that his mom and his grandma, you know, whom he learned how to make the Cuban sandwich from, were very, very particular about how many pickles that were in there. He loved them, and he goes, no, no, no. You have to remember, we only want a few pickles in there. Well, why? If they're so delicious, why not? He goes, no, no, no. You have to have some bites without the pickle so that when you bite and you do get the pickle, you're glad. I mean, so there was like even a psychology to, like a chocolate chip or something like that, something that you got this little extra morsel, you know, that made it special.
Well, and you know, it's about balance, and you know, there's some. What I love about the Cuban sandwich, among many things, is that each place you go has a different signature. Everybody tries to achieve a different thing. They've reached a different audience with their restaurant that wants something the way they want it. If you go out like to I-4 at Brocado's, their sandwiches like this. If you come to Columbia, it's the OG. It's very thin, very well pressed, but there's layer, 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 layer. You know, I-4, they're feeding all the Amazon drivers and the cops and the drivers. They're doing long haul between, say, Tampa and Orlando. Each one has their own constituency and their different kind of ways that they go about it. But pickles can overwhelm, definitely. Classic yellow mustard. It's hard to beat. Anything you want to say about the yellow mustard?
Talk a little bit about its placement, because it matters where it's placed.
So yeah, in the Columbia sandwich, it's only placed on the rooftop, on the inside roof of the sandwich, just one slice. My wife Grace and I were in Charleston over the weekend, and we went to a place called Cafecito. And the woman there makes a great Miami Cuban, but they make a Miami Cuban with Miami bread. They bring it in from Miami, and she puts mustard on the top and the bottom layer. And she goes, it's just the way I like it. I'm like, great. It's a lot of mustard. And a little bit of mustard goes a long way. Traditionally, the sandwich does not have a mayonnaise or an aioli. So this is really where some of the moisture delivery comes in. But again, I think it helps to cut the tartness, number one. It enhances the flavor of the pork. Pork and mustard, been friends for a long time. But it's just enough. And as I said, the architecture of the sandwich, according to the way Richard Gonsmart wants it, is that the mustard's on the top left, so it blooms on the roof of your mouth and doesn't coat your tongue. If it coats your tongue on the bottom, it's a big mustard sandwich. So again, there's so much thought, and we've talked about so far Tampa, Miami, New Jersey, you know, all over. The sandwich has its own travel path. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But, you know, everybody takes their own little angle versus where they are, what they like. The woman, her name is Kathy Atkins in Charleston, was very much about what she grew up with. And she had lived in Charleston for 4 years and missed the Cuban food. That's why she started a Cuban restaurant. I think that's extreme. But, like, I miss Italian food. You don't see me, no. But it's such a part of her DNA. Her grandfather and great-grandfather were both Key West conch Cubans. And so she wanted to represent them and their heritage. And there's a deeper story. I say it all the time. I don't know any other food stuff, maybe coffee, maybe some other things, maybe whiskey, that has such a deep emotional history, geography, story, personal identification, passion. You know, it represents so much. It's so much more than just a lunch item or a dinner item. Maniquia? Awesome. I've learned so much Spanish from Barbara. Usually a lot of the curse words, but that's okay. You know, again, you have a sandwich that has saltiness, sweetness, you got crunch, you got tangy, you got the peppercorn, you got the fat. What does butter bring to it? Well, when you coat the outside of the bread, you know, that raises the profile of it, but it also leads to another part of the conversation about the evolution of the sandwich, because, you know, Tampa Cubans, whether you press them or not, are going to be crunchy. Miami Cubans, you really have to press them to get them to the level of crunch that you get naturally from Tampa Cuban bread. I didn't know if you want to talk about that a little bit, Andy.
Actually, I think it's a good time to jump to Barb's background.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, so first of all, I just wanted to reiterate what Jeff said, to thank you for coming tonight and sharing our obsession, our collective obsession that we have with the sandwich and Cuban culture and Cuban food, generally. So my obsession started many, many moons ago when I was born on the island of Cuba. But I can tell you that I never had a Cuban sandwich on the island as a little girl. Never had one, maybe once or twice, maybe at our home, once we immigrated to the United States in Miami. Usually it was somewhere like this. It was on Calle Ocho in Little Havana, and there were restaurants, Cuban restaurants, dotting Calle Ocho up and down. There were diners and cafeterias, and there were bakeries, certainly. But usually, this next slide will show you where most of the time we would get our Cuban sandwiches. We would walk up to a window. So the word for window in Spanish is ventana, and so a ventanita, Cubans will diminutize everything. We add an ito or an ita to everything. Andy's not just my amigo, he's my amiguito, right? And almost always you walk up to the window, and the ladies, and almost always it's women on the other side, you automatically feel like they've known you your whole life. They call you mi vida, mi corazón, mi cariño. And you order, whatever it is that you like. Usually there are pastries, there are croquetas, right? And when I was a kid, I would go with my dad. Now, in this next slide, you'll see what my dad usually went for. What he usually got was this, a colada. And a colada, you see that styrofoam cup, it's about 8 ounces or so. And for the uninitiated, you think that you can drink that whole thing by yourself. Don't do it. You'll be jacked up for like 3 days, all right? So you would go and you would get the colada, and they would give it to you with this little stack of little shot glasses. They were like plastic or paper sometimes, shot glasses. You would take this back, to your place of employment, for example, and it was a communal thing. You shared this coffee with people around you, and you would just get this little shot of, coffee, and you chatted and what have you. In my dad's case, he would oftentimes take it to Parque Dominó, right, where he would go and he would play dominoes, and he would allow me, when I would go with him, to pick out a pastry or something. But sometimes, go ahead, Jeff, sometimes I would get a Cuban sandwich. Now, this is a Miami Cuban sandwich. This is from the Versailles restaurant, and of course, I know it's Versailles, but Cubans would, the LLES would be Versailles. And as Jeff was pointing out, it's much thinner because it's pressed. And I know that we were at an interview recently where someone said, would we take a stand whether the sandwich should be pressed or not? Now, Jeff at the Columbia, his aim is to please the customer. So you want it straight up, you get it straight up. You want it warmed in the oven, you got it. You want it pressed, okay. No pressed, that's fine too. And Andy is an equal opportunity sandwich eater. He's gonna eat it however way, I want to take a stand, and I want to tell you that the pressing of the sandwich matters, especially if you're in Miami, because the bread is different. That it's kind of like a thinner, kind of eggshell kind of finish, and it's pressed. You see that very deep diagonal cut. That is very important because, well, first of all, Jeff, what did you tell them about what happened that one time that somebody tried to eat it on like?
Yeah, so I was walking through the dining room at the Columbia one time, and I saw, I love to watch how people enjoy the Columbia and enjoy their food. And, I think the natural instinct for me is to eat it from the pointy end. And in fact, there's a gentleman in the book who operates the Boozy Pig, Andrew Tambuzzo, on Cyprus. And we feature him in the book as one of the new wave of young people taking over the mantle. And he says, listen, if it doesn't poke the back of my throat, I won't let it go out of the kitchen. I have seen people eat it from the thick end. However, that's fine. It's like eating a pan flute to me that way, but whatever. But I walked through one day, and I saw someone eating it like a harmonica, and I just thought, oh, that's a problem. But you think about the form and function. This was a street food, essentially a hand food. You would think some things would be intuitive, but not everything is. And ultimately, however you like it is however you like it, but I guarantee you there was mustard from here to here. And, you know,
Yeah, and I'm going to tell
eventually
you.
you're going to have to address both ends, so you might as well.
Might as well. But I'm going to tell you my favorite way to eat it. And certainly, you know, with a tropical fruit batido, like a shake, it's delicious. With a pineapple soda, it's delicious. But if you've not tried it and how I'm about to tell you, you need to do this. Get yourself a nice cup of café con leche, right? So nice whole milk, please, if at all possible, if your diet can stand it. Whole milk, a little bit of sugar to your likeness, some nice, good, strong Cuban coffee. A sandwich cut like this. Take a little sip of your café con leche. Dunk the little pointy end. Yes. Take a bite. Maybe take another bite, then have another sip, and then continue this dance until both things are done and you're sad because you want to do it again. Try that and tell me if it's not delicious.
Okay, I'm about to pass out. Thank you.
Well, one thing to add too is that one of the other profiles I did, they talked about doing that, and it was like, it's a game changer. You got to do that. And then, you know, someone wrote me and who read that and said like, that's nonsense, you know. And it's like, and what's so funny about the Cuban sandwich? And at one point, I actually compared the sandwich to Cuba itself, and that like a consensus may be impossible on like what the perfect version of Cuba or the sandwich is. But so I think that's so interesting, and that's part of the kind of the DNA is like the way you grew up is the only way.
Right. So what we want to do is talk about the history of it. So to give you a little bit of sense of it, and maybe Andrew, you could talk about this as well. I don't know why I'm calling him Andrew. He's Andy. Is sort of how the basic blocks of the book came together, and then how you sort of built around it. You know, history is an elusive thing sometimes, and then you put communist regimes and archives that haven't really been looked through, or there's differences in languages or distance. If you could talk about sort of what you did with the history side of it.
Sure. You know, the profiles are a really important part of the book, and that's like the soul of the book, you know. But, you know, at the same time, I thought some dispassionate study was in order as well. You know, I read in the introduction that if you ask 100 Cubans in Tampa or Miami, you know, you'll get 100 answers told with absolute certainty that the only way is their grandfather's way. And, you know, you idiot, you know, they don't put pork on a sandwich. It's just butter and ham, you know. Everyone's got a different version, and it's pretty amazing. So for me, it was like, what does the historic record actually tell us? And what's interesting is you don't see, there's a lot of citations in that book, and there's none of cookbooks because there were zero help. Because what's interesting is sort of the Cuban cookbooks, and I just got another one donated to the library recently. It's 1922, so it's 100 years ago. I'm looking through it, and there's nothing that represents anything close to what, you know, they're projecting a different image, you know, and it's much more high class, you know, using foie gras, you know, all these other things. So it's like where the Cuban sandwich just didn't make it in that pantheon. So I also find it very interesting that this is something that's so closely associated with Cuba, yet it wasn't considered part of like classic Cuban stuff because it was relatively new. But so we're just gonna run through a few of these, and I'm just gonna stand up so it's easier for me to see. But really, I wanted to go back as far as possible. I started like in the early 1800s, mid 1800s. Barbara was a huge help because if I know enough Spanish to get myself in trouble. So, you know, and then like, okay, what does this mean? But it looks like it might be right. Anyway, so 1872 was the first time I find sandwiches actually being mentioned. So it says, you know, with all different classes of sandwiches along with legitimate beer. So, you know, early on, beer became very important. And I guess tomorrow night, tropical beer is coming back to Florida, which is amazing, and it's an old Cuban brand. So tropical beer would have been one of those beers you had to have with your Cuban sandwich. Next. So, you know, we found a lot of stuff in the late 1800s about sandwiches and like imports. You know, refrigerated imports are starting to be shipped in. But the first time we actually find a Cuban sandwich, well, the very first was in 1898, and it was during the Spanish-American War, and the soldiers are all going to Cuba going like, looking for sandwiches, but of course the island was completely ravaged by war at that point. But we did find though, and this is a reprint of an article in Kansas. So just like now, articles can get picked up and syndicated in lots of newspapers. But so this is actually in New York, and this is a full description of the different layers. So you can see it's a typical wheat loaf. So they're not using pan de agua yet. But what's significant, this is in New York City. It's also significant that there's wafer-thin slices of ham, cucumber pickles, bologna sausage, which I think is probably a mortadella, and mortadella is something that lots of exiles talked about was on the sandwich in Cuba, and somehow didn't make it across the straits. And then, of course, there's chicken as well. So, there's a lot of chicken and turkey in these early sandwiches, and it's really interesting because when there was the big fight about Tampa versus Miami is like, what are they going to do? Put turkey on it next? And it's like, well, actually, Cuba did that a long time ago. Next. So yeah, that was 1901, and by 1909, Cuban bread here in Tampa became really big among just regular folks. It did not take long before kind of the elites in Tampa absorbed all this wonderful flavors from Cuba. So you can see sandwiches are already kind of front and center here. Yeah, this is an ad. So this is an ad for something known as surgisol, but it's basically an antacid. And this is actually a great picture of a lanchero. So, a really important figure in old Cuba was the lanchero, and this is someone who would do all the slicing. So he'd slice the ham, the pork, etc. And, what's interesting is, the early mixtos could very well be walking up to a counter like this and saying, give me a slice of those 4 things, on this sandwich. And a mixto could be, well, whatever you ordered. Over time, it sort of coalesced into something more stable that we know as a Cuban sandwich. But what's interesting is this is the figure on the right is a doctor. He's sort of the mascot of surgisol, and he's going up to this man at the counter saying, "Wait, stop! You're going to get indigestion. Take surgisol, and you'll be able to eat what you want." And so what's interesting is they mention pickles and mustard as being the culprits here, but for Cuba, who have a sandwich called medianoche, the idea of like eating sandwiches late into the night was probably a better diagnosis for what ailed him. Next, please. So that's 1916.
Can I just say, I think that doctor needs to have his skull examined.
Right.
That's not a great start.
No, he's very. And then this is just a great image I loved, and it shows that we think of sandwiches sort of being a Western, like an American and British thing, but all over Europe and all over Latin America, people were seriously obsessed. So this is actually kind of a Rube Goldberg machine. You can see the loaf of bread is at the top and gets sliced and goes through all this stuff, gets mustard and everything put on it. And it's basically a Cuban sandwich without several layers, but it's a ham sandwich. And anyway, so it demonstrates the love for sandwiches, but also this idea that technology can solve problems, right? And I guess, mechanizing things that the lanchero was doing sort of led to the decline in quality of sandwiches. But there's a bigger story there too. Next. So yeah, the ideal cafe. This is interesting because this is Tampa 1920. Look, you can get a club sandwich, a mixed, or a Cuban sandwich. So they lived side by side. So that tells me that the mixed was probably at your discretion, and then the Cuban sandwich was what they were serving. Next. So yeah, this is interesting. So now you start to see places like Million Brothers. I'm not sure if they were Cuban or not, but only 5 sandwiches. And you can see full-sized hot sandwiches. So this is 1935. Sandwiches are already being served hot. They're not necessarily pressed. So like even the Columbia was serving hot sandwiches, but they had a special warming oven, like in the 1940s. So they weren't pressed. And if the earliest pressing in Tampa was actually done with Taylor's irons, as far as we know. And yeah, very heavy, and you press it into a pan. Next. So yeah, and by the 1930s, really, Tampa is starting to beat its chest. And, by the end of the 20s, Tampa journalists are going, oh, we have stuff that Atlanta doesn't have, Oh, they have to come down here to get a Cuban sandwich. So that's how you start to see coverage like this, where, during the Great Depression, and the Florida land boom during the 20s, there's, journalists are trying to do lots of stuff to sort of separate Tampa from other destinations, and this is one of the ways. And this became really, by the time of World War II and afterwards, this was like one of the major draws for Ybor City, right? People used to complain there was nothing to do after you left the restaurant. Next. So yeah, and you can see here, this is Washington, D.C., Liggett soda fountains. So by, the late 30s, you start to see it in drugstores everywhere. People are sort of taking whatever ingredients they have and making their own approximation of a Cuban sandwich. So yeah, it did not take long before it was sort of co-opted, you could say. Next.
And it tripled in price.
Right, yeah. And this is really interesting. This is Miami, 1943. Notice who's right under Valencia, under the direction of Jose de Arriba, formerly of the Columbia restaurant. So there aren't many people, in Florida at the time who knew how to make, really good Cuban food, who were chefs and stuff. And so this is interesting, and it's also interesting because in 1943, if you were going to get Cuban bread, the closest place to get it from was probably, either Havana, but that's international. So a lot of times it would come from Tampa, carried by Greyhound bus. Next. And by the post-war period, Cuban sandwiches sort of joined this new American menu of exotica, right? So you've got like chicken jungle style, whatever that means, chop suey, Cuban sandwiches. It's all part of this, the Hawaiian, Polynesian romance, the South Pacific. Cuban sandwiches just get folded in with all that other kind of exotica. And I think what's interesting too is a lot of people would go to Cuba and not really want to explore menus very much. A lot of Americans who are really squeamish about eating foreign food. So the Cuban sandwich became like the default. When I forget which team was doing spring training down there in the 40s, but anyway, and there was a lot of players, and they just defaulted to the Cuban sandwich because they were too scared to eat anything else. Next.
Of course, my OCD as a former newspaperman sees Helene Polka up top, but it's Helen Polka at the bottom.
Right. Yeah, and it's funny. She's a very funny character. She used to brag that she had the not pretty dancers. Anyway, she was a character. Next. So yeah, Fort Lauderdale, 1947. What's interesting here is I just want you to look at the prices at the bottom. So the Cuban sandwich is 50 cents, whereas the cheeseburger is 35 cents. So once again, it's a more elaborate dish, and really the race to the bottom was just beginning in terms of pricing. And I would say by the 1980s and 90s, it's like, if you pay any more than $3 for a sandwich, you're getting ripped off, And my argument was always it might be worth eating if it's more than $3 for the sandwich. Next, please. Yeah, and at one point I said I would pay $20 for a sandwich if they put all kinds of work into it, and I'm probably going to get my wish before long with inflation. So this is Tallahassee. They ran out of Cuban sandwiches. I also think it's interesting they serve kosher foods with Cuban sandwiches. Next. But it's Tallahassee, right? Tampa, of course, Gasparilla. Cuban sandwiches were just a favorite accompaniment. And, I found an interview that I thought was funny where a lady, it was 11 a.m. and the parade hadn't come by yet, and she'd already eaten her Cuban sandwich, but she brought two. So she wasn't sad. Anyway, next. So yeah, Elmira, New York. And what's interesting is that by the time that people know who Fidel Castro is, this sandwich had gone across the country many times. So in this version has liverwurst and bacon. Yeah, on crisp French bread. So, but that's Elmira, New York, 1954. And that's the other interesting thing is there's a chapter in here called Lost in Translation that just talks about all the weird versions like in the 50s and 60s. Next. Jefferson City, Missouri, so a meal sandwich. And what's interesting here is just like the ones from Ybor City or Havana. So Miami wasn't yet a constellation in this, in this thing yet. Next. 1960. This was my original idea for the cover of the book, but I think it's fine. This was going to be on the back, but then people had so many nice things to say about it that we didn't have room for a picture. But that's a lonchero at the Silver Ring. And I just love everyone sort of gathered around there. And, they used to actually glaze the hams at the Silver Ring, and when they would, take the tailor's iron and sort of, start to melt that sugar, it's an amazing smell, and people would just sort of collect around and what's going on over there. I was a seasonal worker for several years at a honey baked ham, where I used a flamethrower to melt sugar on hams, and even doing that for hours, it never gets old, that smell. Next. So, and by 1961, this is Miami, you could go back 10 years and nobody would have heard about a Cuban sandwich. By 1961, this Highview drugstore is saying they're the master of the Cuban sandwich. And this is right before the Orange Bowl is about to play. So before the football game, get your thing. So this shows really how quickly the Cuban sandwich became, enmeshed in regular life for people who weren't exiles or immigrants. Next. Miami, 1981. This is a great ad just because it shows, El Carmelo is the name of a famous restaurant in Havana. So there's a lot of reopening places. I don't think these people had anything to do with the original El Carmelo, but that's actually where the Eleanor Ruse sandwich supposedly evolved from. We kind of tell that story, a little side story in here about that. And then obviously you got the medianoche sandwich, is more or less the Cuban sandwich, but it's the nocturnal version. So, and my thing is, the more I thought about it, the more I thought the Cuban bread by midnight would all be stale. So why would you order a Cuban bread, a Cuban sandwich after theater? You'd order a medianoche that came on the nice egg bread, would be much softer. And they also tended to be a little smaller, so you're not eating like a big sandwich, right before bed. Next. And of course, the Latin American cafeteria, you can't really talk about the history of the Cuban sandwich and the lonchero. So, that's what was their big contribution, was to bring back the lonchero. So they would have sometimes 6 loncheros all standing behind this counter. They'd have to replace, they'd have these big butcher blocks, and like once a year they'd have to replace them just because they're constantly cutting. And you can see, the home of the Cuban sandwich, so that's just a given. These other things are specials. And then also 25 varieties of sandwiches to choose from. And it depends how you say it. A journalist once said they serve 30 different kinds of Cuban sandwiches, but only one of them is actually called the Cuban, right? Next. Okay, and then we're gonna kind of go to the next step and talk a little bit about some of the profiles we did.
Yeah, and so that was part of the research that was really some of the most passionate and some of the most fun research that we did, is talking to folks who are artisans, so dedicated, so passionate about their craft. And I wanted to share 2 of them with you. We're going to go to one that's really far away in Belfast, Northern Ireland. If you can imagine that, you're there and you come across the Cuban Sandwich Factory. That's Carlos. His full name is Juan Carlos, but Carlos Argüelles. And he was born on the island, and he remembers having his first Cuban sandwich on a train ride to Santiago de Cuba to visit his grandmother. And he remembers it wasn't pressed because it was just like one of the vendors that came onto the train when it made a stop. But it was kind of blazoned in his memory. And when the periodo especial, if you've ever heard about the special period that Cuba went through after the dissolution of the USSR, and how they had to make do with some very difficult circumstances, in 1993, he attempted to get on a boat in the middle of the night and leave the island. He was apprehended by the Cuban authorities. He was thrown in jail. He served time. And when he got out, by serendipity, he's walking the streets of Havana, and he comes across a man who is very upset. He was from Ecuador, and he was a businessman. He was there on vacation, and he had missed his plane. And Carlos brings him back to his house and, got him on the next plane out. Well, he served him some food while he was there in his little apartment. And the Ecuadorian businessman said, "Hey, I have a business venture. How about if you come back with me? I can get you a visa out of here with a job." Carlos hitched a ride back, goes to Ecuador, starts to cook for him. In comes this beautiful young woman, Irish woman, who was there teaching English. They fall in love. He follows her back to the UK. He gets his training in cooking in the UK, and they got married. And he actually starts cooking. He was actually the field cook for the Game of Thrones franchise. And on the very last season, where they finished, he's walking through the Belfast market on his way home, and he's just looking around, and he sees that there's a little application, and it says on there, would you like to have a kiosk here in the Belfast market? So he takes the application, fills it out, mails it in, forgets about it. One of the questions was, what would you sell? And on a lark, he puts Cuban sandwiches. A few weeks later, he gets the go-ahead, and his buddies all bet that he wouldn't sell 10 sandwiches that day. First day, he brings enough material for 40 sandwiches. He sells out in 20 minutes. And he starts gathering whatever he can. He makes another 20, and the same scene is repeated day after day and week after week. And he finally opens up his own brick and mortar shop called the Cuban Sandwich Factory. Born in Cuba, bred in Belfast, he says. And show them the next one. He still has his stand at the Belfast market, but he also has his restaurant. And when I talked to him, they had a daughter. He and the wife had a daughter. And that daughter went on, she just recently graduated from law school. And so the press couldn't send him a copy of the book. So I mailed it to him. And so he sent me a message on WhatsApp. And he goes, this is my daughter. She's so proud that her daddy is in your book. And so it's such a wonderful immigrant story in so many different ways. Now, the next profile is Chef Dennis Martinez Miranda. Chef Dennis was also born in Cuba, but he's of a younger generation, never saw a Cuban sandwich on the island, never tasted one. They immigrated through Venezuela, came into Miami, and the first Cuban sandwich he ever had was in Hialeah, Florida. He went to the Cordon Bleu Culinary Academy in Miami, and soon was hired by Chef Douglas Rodriguez. He is the person that we associate with the Nuevo Latino cuisine. Well, these two particular Asian businessmen kept coming to this restaurant. They love Chef Dennis's food. And one day after work, they proposed to him that they have a business venture for him in Las Vegas, Nevada. And specifically, they had spent a lot of time in Ybor City. And they love Tampa, Ybor City Cuban food. He goes, nothing against Miami, but we really love the food in Ybor City. And we have a concept called Cubanidad 1885. And obviously the 1885 refers to the founding of Ybor City. And so Chef Dennis goes to Las Vegas. And you can see this is their version. They have actually two versions of the Cuban sandwich. The original, the Ybor original, and that one has more of the glazed ham. He gets, bread that is shipped in. La Segunda will overnight bread, by the way, and they par bake it so that you can finish crisping it up, baking it up in your own oven. And then they have the original 305, which is, of course, a reference to Miami's area code. And he uses smoked ham. He uses a couple of different things. But for him, it's really about the pork. And you can see that it's a little bit different kind of construction than what Jeff was talking about earlier. And the pork is shredded. Okay, so he says that the mojo, M-O-J-O, for those of you, you can go to Publix. And in the Hispanic aisle, you can see bottles of mojo. It's sour orange and lime and garlic and oregano. And it gives a delicious taste. Oh, my God, I'm like salivating. If you're not hungry at the end of this, I don't know. So in any event, so if you go to Vegas, check out Chef Dennis. He has, he's doing wonderful work there. And then Jeff, bring it home.
Oh. So this was a sandwich window that used to be on 7th Avenue. It's covered over now. It's the configurations of the Columbia have changed vastly over 117 years. But there was a point at which you could see the Lonchero making the sandwiches in the window. They would make sometimes up to 700 a day. Back in the day, the Columbia has 15 dining rooms now. And back in the day, you had a cafe that was originally the saloon. That had a menu. And then the La Fonda room, which is named for the restaurant that they merged with, that had a menu. The elegant Don Quixote room with the giant chandelier That had a different menu at a higher price point, so did the patio. Everything had a different realm to it. But this was really especially the La Fonda room was where a lot of the sandwiches were consumed, and you got to see them actually made. So, again, everybody likes to say, oh, the Ventanita started in Miami. Well, it's had a lot of origin points. But as Andy was saying, the Columbia would heat them in the oven on request, but they weren't really pressed until the late 50s at the earliest at the Columbia. And third generation owner Cesar Gansmart would use a stack of plates on top of the press to get the actual thin profile on the sandwich if you wanted them pressed. But they were a heated sandwich at most. The way we serve them today, obviously cut on a bias. We serve them on a plate with plantain chips and then lettuce and tomato. And the reason we do that, first of all, it cuts down on steps in case someone wants lettuce and tomato on it. But Richard says, if you want to ruin your sandwich, here you go. So, but the Columbia, it's up until, so a third of the way through the century, had a mixto on the menu. It was known as a mixto. It wasn't really known as a Cuban sandwich until the Anglos started coming from South Tampa. Specifically, the women would come for lunch in Ybor City as an exotic lunch. And the more the Anglo, it's sort of like Chinese food in China. It's just food. The Anglos are the ones who said it was Chinese food or whatever descriptor. The Cuban sandwich really kind of began its profile in the 30s and beyond that. But the Columbia's recipe, as I said, is true to the 1915 printed version, and we know it went back beyond that. And to me, it's like every bite is a little bit of taste, time travel. Every bite is supposed to be uniform and balanced. You don't want too much of one ingredient or another, as I mentioned before. But the history of the sandwich and the history of Tampa and the history of the Columbia all sort of ride the same wave throughout time. I don't know anybody more. Has anyone met Richard Gansmart before? Yeah, a couple hands. Yeah, the rest of you will eventually meet him. There is nobody more passionate about food and how it's prepared, how it's served, how it's consumed than Richard is. And this is the sandwich that he remade. As I said, there's the tomato and there's a pickle spear with it as well. But he wants it to be as close to the traditional version as possible. There are a lot of other Cuban sandwiches in town. As I said, everybody has a different architecture form or different ingredients. I interviewed a Miami chef named Michelle Bernstein, who's Argentine by birth. And she has, first of all, she's an award-winning chef. She's amazing. She doesn't have a Cuban sandwich on her menu. She has a mixto. The Cuban sandwich is the third rail of food. If you don't do it properly and someone calls you out for it, you're dead, especially in Miami. So, she likes to play with the ingredients. If she did that on a regular Cuban, people would lose their minds about it because it represents something. It's that point of passion for people that it's more than a sandwich. It is a cultural identity, it is a political identity. Even, as I mentioned, Andrew Tambuzo at the Boozy Pig, who is part Sicilian, part Cuban, he does Sicilian parts. He makes his own salami. He roasts his own pork, does his own ham. He's a butcher by trade. He makes his own mustard. He makes his own pickles. He doesn't make the Swiss cheese. That's about it, that and the bread. But everything is artisanally done. And it really harkens back to the early days where that was a matter of necessity. But he calls his a mixto because it's a mix of his culture, from his families, third generation butcher. If he would call it a Cuban, people would be like, that's not a Cuban, and they'd be right, but they'd be missing out on a lot of unique personal flavors. And then maybe Andy could talk about this place in Miami. It's sort of the new wave.
Yeah, it's nice. I do enjoy that the profiles sort of go in historical order, and then we end with some of the newest businesses. So that includes like Andrew Tambuzo, who you just mentioned, but also the folks at Sandwich de Miami, and they're doing a very similar thing. They're making everything. They're making the bread too. So I think it's it gives me a lot of hope for the future, right? Because I think around 2000, for me, was the low point. It was sort of like, all right, I don't even know if I'm going to keep trying sandwiches anymore. I was always disappointed, and it didn't seem like people were just putting the love into it. And, you know, and I think the younger generation has definitely stepped up a lot. I mean, the last 20 years, like charcuterie and butchery and all that stuff has really made a big comeback. So, so that's huge, you know, and people willing to put a lot of work into an item that might not be too glorious, right? And I think the economic downturn had a lot to do with that too. I mean, that sort of put the gild on mac and cheese and all kinds of other, you know, foods that we kind of consider more on the humble side. The other thing that they pointed out is that they really disliked too much pickle and mustard, and they felt like it was too much acid and that it got in the way of other things. So they're, you know, they have their own strategy as far as like you don't use too many pickles, et cetera. So they have an interesting story too. But the other thing on pressing is that, you know, this was like a 2-inch thick book, and we pressed it extra thin. No, just kidding. Just kidding. Next. Yeah, you want to mention Versailles?
Yeah, so I had the chance to interview the Valls family, the most recent generation. Her name is Nicole Valls. And, you know, that's really a restaurant that really only started in the early 70s. It doesn't have a huge history like, say, the Columbia does, but it made an impact, and it is now the place when you want to protest or celebrate. It happens outside of Versailles, or Versailles, as you would say. You know, they're known for their ventanita, they're known for their mirrored dining rooms and whatnot, but they've become an absolute culinary force in the Miami area. They're in the airports, they've got locations all over. They have their own commissary where they make their own meats and process everything and get all the croquetas and everything together. You know, it's an amazing thing to be in the middle of something like the Columbia and see what it means to people. I joke about it after being in journalism for 25 years. I'd never worked for a brand that was beloved. That's 5 generations that brought it to that point. My job is to not squander it. And they have a very similar dynamic in Miami where they are a gathering place as much as they are a restaurant. They're a tourism destination, just like the Columbia, but they are a gathering place where people come and either vent out their emotions or sob or, you know, exult. Any basketball triumph happens in front of Versailles about 10 minutes after the game. Football, well, it's been a while. But anyway, you know, she talked about how she was growing up and they would stop by Versailles to pick up sandwiches before they went out on the boat or before they went on a picnic or anything like that. And even for them as the family, the Cuban sandwich was just part of how they enjoyed life. I think we can all associate that as well here. You know, it's an integral part of living in both cities, and I think that's the common bond. And that's the 3 generations right there. We have this photo in the book that they provided, and I'm like, that is a lot of ham. It's a lot of pickle. You know, some people use the long pickle spears. Some people do the pickle chips. Barb was talking about the shredded pork, and you know, the Columbia uses sliced pork to make it more uniform. You know, and sometimes the shredded can dry out if you don't treat it properly. So it's just fascinating to me that everybody takes their own little take on it. But yeah, they're a great family, and they were very, very nice to contribute to the book. And we have our own website, and we're on social media and all that. We're going to continue telling stories about the book and the people who make and enjoy and celebrate these great combinations of flavors. But we thank you for coming. Anybody have any questions? Thank you.